We'll say good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf is Chaf. We are going to begin on Yud Tes Amud Beis. We left off 7 lines up from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Chad Barnash Shero also Yotze. Chad Barnash Betziporin. Ozil Bo'in Mizban Kupad Min Tavcha. So also, if you remember again, we're continuing a little bit from the sugya of yesterday. So the Mishnah spoke about this idea that if you find meat, depending on how the meat is cut up, will determine the kashrus status of the meat. So the Gemara said, for example, if it's a varm, if it's large pieces, that's indicative of the fact that somebody just intended to sell it to their, to feed it to their animal, which of course is indicative of the fact that it's probably in the vela, as opposed to if you find it cut up in smaller pieces. That's indicative of the fact that a person intends it for consumption, and therefore the maisa is considered to be kosher. So we saw yesterday again the fundamental machlokis, or the not the machlokis, but the concepts of kol kavua kamechza amechza damya, or called the parish miruba, parish rove, versus taking something from an established point of origin. So the Gemara tells a couple of stories to that effect. So the Gemara says, Chad barnash b'tziporin. There's a person in Tziporin. Tziporin is Tzipori, north of Eretz Yisrael. Azil ba'i mizban kupad min tavcha. He wanted to buy a piece of meat from the butcher, a legitimate request. And what happens? Velo yahivle. The butcher would not give it to him. So apparently there was some type of falling out between the customer and the butcher refused to sell him meat. All right. Amarle. Romi. So what does the Jew do? The Jew goes to his Gentile friend, the Roman, and he says to the Roman, do me a favor, go into this shop and purchase a piece of meat and then give it to me. Okay, so assuming that the proprietor is not going to refuse selling it to the Roman guy, so just you'll buy it, you'll give it to me. Amarle. So what happens? Well, say he does it. So the Roman does it, purchases the piece of meat, and gives it to the Jew. Amarle. So now the Jewish, let's call him Reuven and Shimon. So Reuven was the one who wanted to buy the money. Shimon is the butcher. Reuven now has the piece of meat that he got from his Gentile friend. He goes back into the store and he says to Shimon, Amarle, lo nasbis al karche. Shimon, did I get you? Right? I bought this piece of meat, literally al karche means against your will. Right? You thought that you were getting me. Now I'm going, now you see I got the meat. Right? So what does Shimon say? Amarle, v'lav basar nevela yahavislei. Oh, I'm sorry, Reuven. In fact, he's a Gentile. So what did I sell him? I sold him a treif piece of meat. So you think you got me? I got you. So obviously you have to understand something. So this case is fascinating on one particular level, which is that now essentially what you have is you have a Jewish butcher claiming that he sold non-kosher meat to an individual that he was in the possession of. He was in the it's a minor. He was in possession of non-kosher meat, and he sold it to this non-Jew. So the question now is, so what happens now to the rest of meat sales that day? Meaning, once he was modeh that he sold non-kosher meat. So question is, what happens now with the rest of the people that bought meat from him that particular day? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yomi and Rabbi Chanina, Maise Balifnei Rebbe. So they brought this case before Rebbe, and what did Rebbe say? Amar, Rebbe said, Lo kula mine meisar makulin ditzipurin. Literally, this butcher is not believed to aser all of the meat that has come out of the marketplaces in Tzipori. Now, both say, take a look at the Tiklin Chadatin. So left-hand side, bottom of the page, 3 lines up from the bottom. Lo kula mina, eino ne'eman, zeh hatabach, le'esar makulin shalair. That literally this one butcher is not believed to go ahead and aser all of the marketplaces in the city. V'chi b'shil shezeh hatabach. Hit es chaveru umachra trefa lenachri lemachra b'makolin v'chaveru lakach me'anachri ne'esar b'shvil zeh likach basar hayom me'anachri b'makolin hoil v'rov tovchei ir Yisrael. So both say what Rebbe said is that since the majority of butchers are kosher butchers, that was the case in Tzipori, and therefore the majority of the meat that is sold is in fact kosher meat. Therefore, lemaisa, we consider this case as the outlier. Even though now he sold non-kosher meat, we do not consider that to be indicative of the rest of his sales, and therefore lemaisa, again, the meat that came out of the marketplace on that day is kosher. Yes, we do believe him that he sold. If he says that he sold non-kosher meat to this Gentile, we're not going to contradict his assertion, but at the same time, this one sale of non-kosher meat does not in any way ruin the majority of kosher meat sales. Now, also, I show you something interesting just about this. If you take a look, Take a look at the Karban Ha'eda on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, it's the first commentary on the right-hand side. So take a look about 5 lines before it ends. Va'amar, Rebbe said, Lav kol kamine le'esar makolin ditzipori, v'chevan shelo hichrizu treifa bo bayom habasar motor. So the Karban Ha'eda quotes a fascinating practice. Apparently, what used to happen was that if during the course of the day there was an animal that was a treifa, right? Now a treifa could mean a couple of different things. A treifa could mean that they shechted the animal and they found some type of blemish on the lungs. Or they found that the animal, it's not just the lungs, they found some type of terminal illness within the animal itself. Or somebody botched the shechita. What they used to do is they would announce that, just to understand, that there was an animal today in the slaughterhouse that was a treifa. Now, why was that important to announce? Because what that told people is there's going to be non-kosher meat for sale that day. Because obviously, what would you do with the treifa? You'd sell it to the non-Jews, right? Or for that matter, the Jews, or you could sell it to Jews for their animals. But the point is, apparently what the Karban Ha'eda says is that whenever there was a treifa, they would announce it in the marketplace that people should be extra vigilant about what it is that you're buying. It's just interesting. So in this case, Rav went ahead and said that Lemaisa, this one act, this one sale of non-kosher meat does not ruin the rove, and the rove is that kosher meat is in the marketplace. Fine. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachas L'Taman. Rav went to Bavel, and what happened? Makilin. He saw that they were very lenient. I both say it doesn't say what they were lenient in, but apparently what he picked up on was a general, almost lackadaisical approach to their Judaism. So what does he decide? The Chamra Alein. So Rav says there's a new sheriff in town, right? So what happens? Rav says he has to clearly fix what he felt to be the breaches within halachic observance in the community. So he goes ahead and he's machmir on them. Now again, the Gemara doesn't tell us what he was machmir with. Now the Gemara says once he's there, a story happened. Now both say we will see this story is not reflective necessarily of a chumrah of Rav, but it's just brought up in this context. Listen to this. Chad Barnash Azil, there was a person who literally went, top of Chaf, Boi Mishizga Askufase, Bego Nahara. He wanted to go ahead and wash his meat in the river. That will say, if you take a look at the Tiklin Charatin, he says, Mishazgi Basra Askufe, Rachas Basra Benar, Vinafal Linahar, Va'azal Va'acha Kakra Likhamir. So I will say, according to Tiklin Charatin, what happened over here is that he went to the river to wash his meat. I guess he bought it from the marketplace. And I will say, it's not like today where you go to the supermarket, you buy, or wherever, you go to the butcher, you buy a piece of meat, and it's mamish, it's ready to go. You bought meat, and the only thing the shochet was generally guaranteeing you was what? That it was shechted, right? It was geshacht, right? It was shechted properly. Maybe, depending on when you were buying it, maybe that it was salted. But generally, you had to take care of this. You had to take care of the rest yourself. So the guy goes down to the river to wash the meat. So according to Tiklin Charatin, what ends up happening is he puts the meat in the water and he loses the meat. According to the Karban Ha'eda and others, it's not that he lost the meat, but rather, again, what ends up happening is he forgot some meat there by the bank of the river. So let's read it. It doesn't. The truth is, practically, it's the same issue as we'll see. So what happens? V'inshisa v'azile. So he forgot it by the bank of the river, and he left. Chazar boi mesibne. So he came back. He realized he forgot the piece of meat by the bank of the river. He goes back to the river, and now he figures, okay, I'm going to retrieve the meat. So what happens? So Amrali Rav says it's aser lecha. You can't eat this meat. Why? Did not Amrle, because I could easily say, Hahi shataf nara, literally, the river has taken this piece of meat, Va'aisi churi dinevela tachtui, and it has replaced this piece of meat with a piece of nevela, a piece of non-kosher meat. So I'll say, what does this mean? Take a look at the Tiklin Charatin for just a moment. So Tiklin Charatin writes, he says, actually take a look at the Karban Ha'eda. Let's do Karban Ha'eda. He says, Amrli Rav, also the top line, Asalacha Basar Zeh, Shani Omer Harishon Shatfonar, Vehevi Basar Achar Shal Nevevim Komer. So I'll say here, Rav is introducing us to a new concept called basar shenis aleim min ha'ayin, which means what? That if you have meat, see, we often assume that as long as you know that the meat is kosher, that's enough. It's not true. In order for you to ascertain that meat is kosher, you have to have had an awareness of that meat the entire time it's been in your possession. But if somehow that meat slipped out of your consciousness, that meat, again, or more than consciousness, that meat was out of your sight, then we have to be choshesh that perhaps the meat that you left is not the meat that you found. And therefore, Rav says, Reuven, you left the meat by the bank of the river, so now you're assuming you come back, the meat's in the same exact spot. That must be the very meat that you left. The halacha says, it's a chumrah. The halacha says, no, we're machmir again in terms of the kashrut of the meat, that maybe the meat that you left is not the meat that you've come back to, and therefore he asered the meat. I will say, by the way, just so you should know, this concept of basar shenis ali min ha'ayin is halacha l'maisa. That's what you'll see to your achmiel about it. I'll tell you the applications of it in the kashrus industry. That's why, again, if a mashgiach is locking something up, he just can't put the piece of meat. He's got to put a seal on it. There's got to be some kind of siman on it that it's clear that even if he leaves the room, when he comes back, it's the same piece of meat. Basar shenis ali min ha'ayin. So one tells another story. Basar shenis ali min ha'ayin. Chad barnash hava mahalich b'shuka. There was a man who was walking in the marketplace. Ta'un kupad, and he was holding a stake. Okay. Could hold the steak. So asa daisa v'chatfasa minei. So we'll say literally a daisa. A daisa is a vulture. So a vulture came along and grabbed a piece of meat from him. V'talkose. Chazer boi mispinei. So what happens? So the vulture went ahead and took the piece of meat, and now the vulture flies off a little bit, and then the vulture drops the piece of meat. The man figures he finds his piece of meat, and now he wants to retrieve it and eat it. Amarli Rav Aser. Rav says, Rav says, it's no, you can't eat it. Why? Dina Amar, because I could say, Basar dinevela havis ta'ina, vital kase vinaspahahu aurchrana. Because I could say that maybe the vulture was holding more than one piece of meat. And the piece of meat that the vulture dropped, maybe he swooped up your kosher piece of meat. He also swooped up a non-kosher piece of meat. And maybe the piece of meat that he dropped was what? Was the non-kosher piece of meat. Okay, so again, on both sides, it's the same idea. Basar shenis ali min ha'ayin. Once you lose visual contact with your meat, and again, there's no identifying siman. The assumption is that there's not going to be an identifying siman on a piece of meat. So therefore, the ma'isa, again, you cannot assume that the piece of meat that you lost is the piece of meat that you found. I will say, I forgot to mention that the shir today is dedicated by Chaim and Jackie Nachman in memory of Jackie's mother, Drezel Nechama Bas Chaim Yidol, and we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Hashem will have an aliyah. Amen. Okay, so another example of that basar shenis ali min ha'ayin. So we'll say the Gemara tells another story. The Gemara says the following: Ginoi. We'll say if you take a look, just one second before we go on, take a look at the tickle in Charatin. Again, bottom right hand corner, bottom right hand side. It's about 6 lines in. Basar dinevela she'achaya haisa tuuna. Efshar basar dinevela v'shlicha b'lacha zeh basar v'kol kach hachmir b'makom shira mikilim. So both say the tickle in Charatin attributes this chumrah of Rav to the fact that they were very makil in Bavel. But I'm just pointing out that although that might have started out as a chumrah in Bavel, it absolutely became part of normative halacha over time. This concept of basar shenis ali min ha'ayin. So the Gemara goes weiter. Ginoi shataf zikin. So another story. Ginoi is the Ginoi River. The Ginoi River once washed away. Zikin Rabosai are wineskins. Remember again, what they used to do is they would take, very often it was the stomach of the animal, and they would convert it essentially into a bag, or you can make it out of sewn pieces of leather together as well. They'd make a wineskin. So what happens? The Ginoi River once washed away the wineskins of a number of Jews. So obviously the problem with that is what? Wine of a non-Jew is problematic. At worst, it's yayin nesech. It's idolatrous libation wine. At best, it's what's called stam yenom, the regular wine of a non-Jew, which is still aser. So now the question is going to become, what happens to those wineskins? So what happens? Ginoi shat of zikin, asa uvda kamei Rabbi Yitzchak. So we'll say what happened. So the river washed away the wineskins, but then afterwards, the owners of the wineskins tracked down wineskins. They found wineskins washed up by the river. So the shaila is, could they assume that the wineskins that they found were the wineskins that they lost? So the Maisi came before Rabbi Yitzchak, and he said the following. Kumi Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Lazar, va'amar yachachmun shafaya kitrehon. Literally, let these wise men examine their knots. So I'll say apparently the way you would knot the top of the wineskin, and apparently people used to tie knots in different ways. So one of the ways in which you'd be able to, and again, this was also one of the ways of an identifying siman. So essentially, Yitzchak says, listen, if you could identify your knot on the wineskin, and the knot is still intact, then what? Then that's enough evidence of the fact that this is the wineskin you lost. That's A. And B, what else does it prove? That the wine has not been tampered with. Because you have to prove two things. A, that it's yours, and B, that the wine inside has not been tampered with or replaced with anything else. So as long as you can recognize your knot, and your knot is still intact, you could go ahead and enjoy the wine. So the Gemara goes weiter. Nikunika. So nikunika is a container of wine. Nikunika ashtachach biknishta debuli. They once found a barrel of wine, a container of wine, biknishta in the shul in the city of Buli. Asa uvda kumei Rabbi Yirmiyah. So what happened? So the Shaila says, what was the status of this particular wine? So the Gemara says, they came before Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak says, Amar Yischakamon Sakaruye Avidetuhin. Literally, it will say, if you look at the Tiklin Charitin, Sikiruya, Osan Shesikru Besikra Lirshama Chavio. So what often happened was that when they would bottle, or I guess what we call bottle or barrel wine, so they would often go ahead and make markings on the container to indicate again if the what the batch was, if it was kosher or not. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, let the people who work in the bottling company, who normally make the roshem, who make the mark on the barrel, let them come and attest to the fact that this barrel is in fact a barrel of kosher wine. So we'll say what you're seeing over here is the following. After we got finished saying that there's a concept of basar or yayin, shenes ali min ha'ayin, let's say with meat, that ultimately you lose visual contact with it. So now the Gemara is saying, however, if there are identifying simanim on the receptacle that houses the item, that even if you've lost visual contact with it, that allows you to establish the fact that the item that you found was in fact the item that you lost. Gedi tzli, another interesting case. Let's say you lost a kid. Now we'll say again, this is the kid that you eat, not the kid that you eat. So you lost your roasted kid. Okay. So the Gemara says, Ishtachach ba'asrachi de gufta vehetiru. So I'll say, listen to this. So they once found the roasted kid. They found the roasted kid, b'asrachi de gufta. But I'll say, if we take a look again at the Tiklin Charitin, Isracha is a shuk, is a marketplace. Gufta is a place. So we'll say, so first of all, this sounds so strange to us in our current climate of kashrus, but it's fascinating. So they find you can imagine, find a roasted kid. And the shayla, is it kosher or not? And what happens? They found it in the marketplace of Guftra, and they permitted it. Why do they permit it? They also, this is actually quite fascinating. Mishum shnei dvarim. They permitted it for two reasons. Number one, mishum metzia, because of just the general halachos of finding lost objects, which we'll define in just a moment. Umishum rov mahalchei drachim, and because of the majority of pedestrian traffic. Now, what does this mean? Mishum metzia. I will say, what does it mean that they permitted it because of mitzia, because it's a found object? The time I will say, listen to this. Hamatzil miyad ha'ari. I will say, if let's say I save someone's property from a lion. I don't know, a lion is attacking Reuven's property, and I save that property from a lion, or miyad hagayis, or there's a band of armed robbers that are trying to steal something from Reuven, and I go ahead and save the item, or mishunas hayam umishunas hanar, or I save it from a surge of the sea, or a surge of the river, it's about to be washed away, or something is lost in a large marketplace and I find it. In all of these cases, and this is halacha l'maisa, in all of these cases, the object that you find is yours. So again, in all of these cases, again, where I find this object, I say this object is mine. Why? I will say why? Because again, the owners are misyayish. Now, what's yeyush? Yeyush means when you give up hope of ever retrieving an object. So when you give up hope of ever retrieving an object, essentially what you do is you relinquish your ownership rights. When you relinquish your ownership rights, what do you do to that item? You make it hefker. Oh, it's good. All right. When you make it hefker, it means anybody who gets it ultimately could acquire it. So the Gemara is saying over here that in the normal circumstances, when people see their property in a hopeless situation, they give up. So if I see a lion attacking something of mine, I'm not fighting that lion. So pretty much what I've done is I've written that off. I've already claimed that as a loss. Or again, I see the river washing something away, I'm not getting that back again. Or I lose it in a large public place. This is assuming things that don't necessarily have a clear or defining siman or a unique siman. I write these things off. So the Gemara is saying, if I am the finder and I find any of these items, I'm in fact permitted. So this is reason. So therefore, if you lose your roasted kid in the marketplace, so the assumption is most people assume that what? I'm never going to find that again. Besides the fact that, again, I'm not going to assume that somebody's going to return. I'm just never going to find it. So the assumption is that the Bailim, the owners, have Yeosh. So that was reason number one, that they permitted. So again, remember, what's the case over here? So a Jew is finding this roasted kid in the marketplace of Gufta. So first of all, number one, Alts Elam Etzias, we'll call it Choshen Mishpat. They say you could keep it. Right? You could keep it. Why? Because the assumption is the owner had Yeosh. Okay, but that doesn't tell me what? Right, it tells me it's kosher. All it tells you is that I could keep it. What about the fact that it's kosher? That's number two. Mishum rov mahalchei drachim. So what does it mean? And number two is because of the majority of pedestrian traffic. Because of the majority of pedestrian traffic. I'm sorry, I just lost the place over here. Mishum shchitas nochri. Now, literally, what that means is you need not be concerned that it was shechted by a non-Jew. I will say, what does that mean? That apparently the case over here in Gufta was the majority of people were Jewish. So the majority of people were Jewish, and therefore, again, lemaisa, you could assume that the animal itself was kosher. So therefore, again, they permitted this individual who found they roasted. Again, I've just apparently now I'm getting texts in the middle of shir with information. I shouldn't say roasted kid, young goat. Young goat. I appreciate it. Please feel free to text your comments to me while I'm in the middle of giving the shir. I do appreciate if you have suggestions, perhaps things you'd like me to do differently. 443-803-4354. Please. So the young goat. So I thank our anonymous shir contributor for that. So therefore, again, they allow this individual to keep the young goat on two reasons. Number one, the choshen mishpat idea, because halacha lemaisa, it's a lost object for which the owner has total yeosh. And number two, the majority of people are Jewish, and therefore we could assume that the goat itself was kosher. Fine. And the Gemara says, interestingly, there's an interesting postscript. V'ishtachach the Beis Rebbe. Did I skip a few lines? No, you're skipping a few lines because the Gemara is going to go ahead. Okay. It's just like open mic day. Yeah, text it in, say please. Text it next time. All right. So the Gemara says the following. Yes, and if you text me by 5:40, I'll make sure to have your coffee. How you like it in your place. So the Gemara says the following. Eagle de Guvna. Another case. A wheel of cheese. So Uigel de Guvna ishtachach bepundaka de Levi. So they once found the wheel of cheese in the pundak. Pundak is an inn in which Levi was staying. Okay, so we'll say same shaila comes up. So the question is, what do you do with can you eat the wheel of cheese? So the Gemara says, v'hitirua. They permitted the cheese for Jewish consumption for two reasons. Mishum shnei dvarim. Mishum metzia. Umishum rov mahalchei drachim. They permitted the cheese for two reasons. Number one, because laws of mitzvah, again the choshen mishpat, and because of the rov of the pedestrian traffic. What does it mean mishum mitzvah? So we'll say the Gemara quotes the same thing. Mishum mitzvah detani hamatzil miyad hagayis. Again, same thing as we said before. Somebody who says something from Guys, Rabbi in this case is an armed bandit. Miyad ha'ari from a lion. Mishuna sayim surge of the sea, surge of the river. Isracha gidola, large marketplace. Placha gidola hareusho. So we'll say again in all of these cases, a person, the owner is miyayish. The owner gives up hope of ever retrieving the object, and therefore lemaisa, the finder is permitted to keep it. And so we'll say. So number one, we assume over here that the inn is considered to be a public place. So because it's considered to be a public place, the assumption is that anyone who loses an object in an inn does not have any hope of retrieving that object. So now we see outzchoshen mishpat, you are permitted to go ahead and keep the object. Like we said before, that only tells me I can keep it. It doesn't tell me what, if I can eat it. So then the Gemara says, and there, because in all these cases where you lose the object under these circumstances, the owners are miyayish. They don't have any hope of retrieving it. Therefore, number one, we establish you can keep the wheel of cheese. Okay, now I know I can own it. Can I eat it? So the Gemara says, mishum rov mahalchei drachim, and what does it mean? Because of the majority of pedestrian traffic, mishum gavinas nochri, because we don't have to be concerned that it's cheese of an Jew. Again, I will also remember there is a concept of gavinas akum, which means that a Jew is not permitted to eat of the cheese of a non-Jew, and that's because a couple of different reasons about that. But the simplest reason was because often there was animal rennet that was used to go ahead and create the cheese, which of course can be halachically problematic if it comes from a non-kosher animal. Might even be problematic if it comes from a kosher animal of a din of basar b'challah, but that we'll get to when we get to chulin. So both sides. So therefore, it turned out that they permitted this wheel of cheese again. Number one, because the assumption is the owners were miya'ish, and number two, because the majority of people that came through the inn were Jewish, and therefore the mice of the cheese was permitted. And we both say what happens? And sure enough, what occurred? Min mishkachach min Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yossi, and it turned out to say that it was actually Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Yossi's cheese. So it turned out meaning that all the Gemaras, these postscripts are just to say that they made that right halachic calculations, and it's just interesting to see that the right halachic calculations in fact mirrored the actual reality. Fine. So both say Gemara, Amar Rab Mana Kumi Rabbi Yossi. Both say this is very interesting. So now Rabbi Yossi said, Rab Mana said before Rabbi Yossi something fascinating. Va'anan chamyon Rabbanan machrizin. So he says, I will say, Rab Mana said to Rabbi Yossi, but I'll tell you it's interesting. Because in both of these cases, you said that the owner could keep the object. But I'll tell you that I've seen the rabbis in certain circumstances, this is talking about personal anecdotes. I've seen when our Rabbanim have found objects in similar situations, where there was an implied Yeush, and where there was a majority of Jewish people. And so therefore, halachically, they would have been entitled to keep it, but they didn't. They achriz means they announced it. So even though when they were entitled to keep the object, they still announced it. I will say, take a look. Take a look at the Tiklin Charitin. Actually, no. Take a look, at the Carbon Ha'eda. So look at the Carbon Ha'eda writes, left-hand side, Amar Rab Mana. It's in the short lines about, call 10 lines down. Amar Mana, Lifnei Rabbi Yossi, Va'anu Rowan Shechachamim Machrizin, Afilu Motzin Beplacha Gedol Sharma Komos Kotzevahan. So now we'll say, after the Gemara goes ahead and kind of lays down this halachic ruling, you have Rabbi Yossi coming before Amana, or Amana coming before Rabbi Yossi and saying, but the rabbis don't follow this. Meaning the rabbis, in fact, even though the rabbis would be entitled to go ahead and keep these objects, they still announce it. So Rabbi Yossi responds very interestingly. He says, Amrlei, At in Havyasa Mishkachach Lo Naspas. So interesting. So Rabbi Yossi says to Ramana, tell me, Ramana, and if you were to go ahead and find an object like this, would you not keep it? So Rabbi will say what Rabbi Yossi was telling Ramana is, I don't understand. Don't make it sound like if you found an object in these circumstances, you wouldn't keep it. Of course you would keep it. After all, Rabbi Yonah Avuch, Rabbi Yonah, your father. So we'll say, just take a look at the Karban Ha'eda for one more second. Amarlei, atum hayisa motzei davar, lo hayisa not la'atzmecha. If you were to find such an object where you do not keep it for yourself. So back to the Gemara. Rabbi Yonah avuch, Rabbi Yonah, your father. Both says this is Rabbi Yossi speaking to Rabbi Mana. So Rabbi Mana, your father, Rabbi Yonah, lo amar kain, ela amar halevai kad nishkach min piyusa uligavo. So we'll say, listen to this. So Rabbi Yossi said to Ramana, Ramana, I want to tell you, your own father, Rabbi Yonah, sometimes I would be with him when he would find an object, and he would say, if only I would have found this in a public place. Now I would say, what does it mean if I would have found this in a public place? No. Meaning what he was lamenting the fact was, now, look, it's a good object, but I have to return it, obviously, because I found it in a situation I have to return it. If only I would have found it in a public place, I would have been permitted to keep it. So what Rabbi Mana was saying to Rabbi Yossi is, I don't understand what you're talking about the rabbis who announced this stuff when they could keep it. Your own father would have kept it. So the Gemara says, Afilu kain ashkach v'lo nasib. So we'll say, Rabbi Mana responds back to Rabbi Yossi, listen, I want to tell you, there were yes, my father said that, but I will tell you firsthand that there were circumstances when my father found things that he would have been entitled to keep, and yet what? And yet he still announced them. Then Rabbi say again, so this is also an interesting thing in halacha. Obviously, again, there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. The letter of the law is, as in the circumstances spelled out above, you are permitted to keep the object. So again, if you find it in a public place or in any circumstance or in any situation where you could assume that there is circumstantial yeyosh, right? And you could rely on the fact that there's a rove of pedestrian traffic, you could keep the object. You could definitely keep the object. But there also is a midas chasidus. There's a certain level of piety of going above and beyond, trying to track down the owner of the object, even if you are not entitled to do so. Says the Mishnah. What's another interesting Mishnah? Behema shenimtzeis miyushalayim vad migdal eder. If they found an animal. They will say this is a live animal. They find an animal between Yerushalayim and Migdal Eder. And I will say Migdal Eder is around the area of Beis Lechem. So you find an animal between Yerushalayim and Migdal Eder, or for that matter, Migdal Eder is just giving you a distance. But in fact, what it's saying is if you find an animal within that distance of Yerushalayim, Migdal Eder is approximately 15 kilometers from Yerushalayim. So what the Mishnah is saying is, if you find an animal within 15 kilometers of Yerushalayim, again, remember, it's not limiting it to the direction of Migdal Eder. It means 15 kilometers in all directions. Then what? Zecharim olos. If it's a male animal, you assume it's an ola. Nikevos zivchei shlamim. If it's a female animal, you assume it's a shlamim. And I will say again, see here what's happening over here? The Gemara is making the assumption that livestock, stray live, this is not talking about animals that I have in my own personal ownership. This is saying you find a stray. You find a stray. So what happens? You assume that within certain proximity to Jerusalem, this is an escaped carbon. This is an escaped carbon, or it's a lost carbon. Rabbi Huda says, again, what that would mean is, often you can't go ahead and track down the owner of the animal. So what it's saying is that halacha l'maisa, you would have to offer it up as a carbon. So if you find that animal, your responsibility would be to offer it up as a carbon. So Gemara takes this weiter. Rabbi Huda says, Harari l'psachim kol dol l'regel amid yom. If you find within 30 days before Pesach, if you find a stray animal that looks like that is fit for Pesach, and I will say again, remember, in order to be a carbon Pesach, you need an animal to be within its first year. So if you find an animal that is fit for Pesach within 30 days before Pesach, you assume that animal is a carbon Pesach. Barishona hayu memashkinin es motza'eha ad shehu mevi ima nesacheha. Suppose I listen to what happened. Originally, when you found an animal, also remember, many karbanos have accompanying nisachim, have accompanying libations. So what would happen? So if you go ahead and you find this stray animal, now you have to bring it as a carbon, which also means what? You have to bring nisachim. So what would Beis Din do? If Beis Din heard that you would go ahead and that you had found an animal that has to be brought as a carbon, they would seize collateral from you in order to ensure that you paid for the nisachim, in order to ensure that you brought the proper nisachim, because there was a concern that people would say, listen, it's not my animal. Why do I have to bring? So they seized collateral to ensure that you would bring the nisachim. However, what happened? Chazru lihios manichin osa ubarchin. You know what happened? So what happened? What happened when people saw a stray animal? They just walk the other way. You see a number of examples like this where Chazal made a takana in order to go ahead and they thought preserve the greater good, and then they realized that what ended up happening is people just said forget about it. Like I was saying, in general, people don't want to be bothered. If you make something too difficult for people, they're just gonna walk away. So it backfired. So what happened? So Chazru. Hiskinu Beis Din shehu nechasin ba'im mishal tzibur. So what did Beis Din establish? Beis Din said, okay, you know what? Here's what's going to happen. If you find an animal that is set aside for sacrificial use, then lemaisa, what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and we're going to say, you bring the animal. Beis Hamikdash will pick up the tab for the Nesachim, right? We'll bring that from communal funds. Amar Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon says, now once you speak about rabbinic enactments, the Rav Shimon Zayin Torah Meskidu Beis Din. So the Beis Din Agadol established 7 things. I will say, obviously, they established much more than 7 things. It's 7 things in this particular context. What are they? So one of them is the thing that we just read, namely that Lamaisa, if you find a carbon, and now you want to go ahead and you're going to bring it, Beis Din will pick up the tab for your nesachim. What else did they establish? If a non-Jew goes in and sends an olah from overseas, and he sent nesachim in there. Also, you have to understand something. One of the things that we don't always appreciate when it comes to the Beis Hamikdash is, we say it in slichos, ki beisi beis tefila yikare lechol ha'amim. The Beis Hamikdash was special. Not just for Klal Yisrael, the Beis Hamikdash was special for humanity, because non-Jews could offer karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash as well. Everybody could connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Beis Hamikdash. Let's say you have a non-Jew that sent an olah from overseas. And what happens? V'shalach iman nesachim, and he sent nesachim along with it. And I will say, now what does it mean he sent nesachim? It can't mean that he sent his wine, because if he sent his wine, we're not offering up his wine. What it means is he sent money for nesachim. Then what? Krevim mishalo. Then we say thank you to the non-Jew. We say thank you for your carbon, thank you for the nesachim, and we purchase the nesachim with his money. Ve'im lav. But let's say he just sent the carbon, but he didn't send the nesachim. Then what? Kraven mishal tzibor. Then we go ahead and we pay for the Gentiles nesachim through communal funds. Rabbi say this is quite fascinating, because what would happen if a Jew showed up and brought his carbon and didn't want to pay for the nesachim? Come back when you want to spend for your nesachim. So it seems to be mipnei darkei shalom. It seems to be in order to preserve greater peace with our Gentile neighbors. If for some reason this carbon shows up without the money for the nesachim, the Jewish people pick up the tab for that. Quite interesting. V'chein gershem. Similarly, if a convert died, the aniach zvachim, and he left behind karbanos. So we'll say again, let's say either he left animals that were designated as karbanos, or he left money that was designated for sacrificial purposes. So im yesh nesachim krevim mishalo. If he has money in his estate, I will say again, the reason why they're using a ger shemes is because that's the only case in halacha where you could have a situation of what? Where somebody dies without yarshim. Somebody dies without inheritance, meaning let's say a person converted, never married, never had children. So you could have a situation where, again, technically he dies and has no family. So in that case, he goes ahead and we take from his estate. But if there's no money in his estate, Kraven Mishal Tzibor, then we take the money from communal funds. Kraven Mishal Tzibor, Utnai Bezdinhu, Rabbi say another interesting idea. Utnai Bezdinhu, Al Kohen Gadol Shames. Rabbi say, listen to this. Let's say the Kohen Gadol dies, Shetei Minchaso Kraven Mishal Tzibor, that his mincha, Rabbi say every single day, the Kohen Gadol brought a carbon mincha called the Asir Sa'efa. And what happens is actually this carbon was split into two pieces. He offered one piece in the morning, one piece in the evening. So let's say again, you could now under normal circumstances, or one piece in the afternoon, not evening. Under normal circumstances, Kohen Gadol dies, you appoint someone quickly. Let's say for some reason there's a delay, whatever the reason is. So the halacha is we continue to bring the Kohen Gadol's mincha, even in the absence of the Kohen Gadol himself. And where does that money come from? The money comes from Tzibor. The Tzibor, Rabbi Huda says, no, Mishal Yarshim. No, it's not true, it doesn't come from the Tzibor, but rather it comes from who? The Kohen Gadol's inheritors. The Gemara goes weiter. Ushlema haisa kreva. And I will say, this is just an interesting aside, if there was no Kohen Gadol, when they would offer up the Kohen Gadol's mincha, they wouldn't split it into two portions, but rather what? They would offer it up at once. Ala melach.
What do you mean, offer what up at once?
The mincha. Kar mincha. They would split the kar mincha up into two portions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, then they would offer it up at once. Rabbi Huda says, this is Mishal Yarshin. So the Gemara says the following. Another takana is, the rabbis instituted that the Kohanim could get benefit from the salt and from the wood. Now I will say, what does that mean? Kohanim get sacrificial parts of animals. Obviously what that means is they have to prepare it for consumption. Where are they going to prepare it? The pashtos in the Beis Midrash. In order to prepare meat, what do you need? You need salt and you need wood, right? You need fire, you need salt. So we'll say. So remember, there's plenty of fire, there's plenty of wood, and there's plenty of salt in the Beis Midrash. But who does it belong to? It belongs to the Beis Midrash. The rabbis instituted that part of the hektish, part of the consecration status of the wood and the salt in the Beis Midrash was what? That it was allowed to be used for the Kohanim for their personal sacrificial purposes. Obviously, if the Kohen brings lunch from home, he can't go ahead and use the salt to go ahead for that. And he can't use a log to heat a fire to heat up his wife's leftovers. That you can't do. But Lamaisa, to go ahead and cook the sacrificial parts that are his, Chazal instituted that he can do that. Va'ala para, similarly on para aduma, shelo yu mo'alin ba'afra. We'll see what this means in the Gemara, that there is no mi'ilah. Remember, mi'ilah means inappropriate use of consecrated property. There is no me'ilah with its dust. Va'alakinin hapsulos shihu ba'os mishal tzibor. Well, it's another interesting idea. If they were invalidated bird offerings. Now, what does that mean? Let's say you had the following circumstance. Let's say, remember we spoke about this last 2 days, where you had your shofar, you had your receptacle that was there for money of the kinim of the bird offerings, which are chatas offerings. So let's say now something happens. Let's say they shecht one of the birds, and it turns out that the bird is puzzled, the bird is treif, or whatever, something else. So what happens? You need to offer a replacement carbon, right? Why do you have to offer a replacement carbon? I will say because lemaisa, again, somebody's relying on that carbon for their own atonement purposes. So where does that money come? So remember what happened. So Mrs. Schwartz dropped off her money for her kinim, and what happens? She went home. So what happens now that her bird is treif? So where does it get replaced from? communal funds. So we'll say it's quite fascinating. So you see that the Beis Hamikdash itself is picking up the tab on many things. So the Beis Hamikdash picks up the tab on the replacement carbon if something was invalidated. But we saw yesterday, Rabbi Yossi says, no, it wasn't the Beis Hamikdash. Who picked up the tab for replacements? We saw this yesterday already. Hamesapek es hakinin, hu mesapek es apsulos. The guy who landed the contract, the bird contract with the Beis Midrash, which was a very lucrative contract. So part of his contract was what? We saw yesterday that in the event of any losses, like for example in the case of where the money landed mechza al mechza in between the two, the guy who supplied the birds would pick up the lost wages for the first shofar. In the case of invalidated karbanos, he also picked up the loss. Okay. I'm sorry? Replacement clause, right? So the Gemara says the following. I will say, and just so you should understand, in general, all of the contracts of the Beis Hamikdash carry with it some exceptional level of risk. Meaning, if you have careless kohanim or whatever, you just have some. So it could end up costing you. But remember, it appears that people made it up. The vendors made it up in sheer volume. If you could just imagine the volume of supply of these contracts, must have been enormous. Says the Gemara. Rav Oshia Rabba Amar. So we'll say, so the Gemara says the following. Take a look again at the Karban Ha'eda. So the Karban Ha'eda writes, Lavo b'damei Shano, Kolomar, Ihi vadai lo karban. V'achi kamar, im ba adam zeh hamotza la'asos la'takana, uba l'kabel al atzmo chov kol damim, shuhu b'safek, u'lotzia l'churun lahaktish es dameha. And so we'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, when we speak about this idea, remember we said before, the Mishnah started off by saying that if you find an animal from Yerushalayim until Migdal Eder, so within 15 kilometers of Yerushalayim, so if it's a male animal, it's considered to be an olah. And if it's a female, it's considered to be a shlam. So the Gemara says, what's the case over here? The case was not where you're offering up the animal itself, because we don't know with absolute certainty what the animal is, but rather what you're going to do is you're going to redeem the animal with money, and you're going to keep the animal, and the money is going to be sanctified. So then the Mishnah is telling me, what do I do with the money? So if it's a male animal, the money is going to go towards an olah. If it's a female animal, the money is going to go towards shlamim. So I'm going to say, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Omrim lo Adam Tzei Ma'ol B'Kachim. So we'll say, the Gemara says, I don't understand what that means. Is that Lamaisa, are we going to tell a person to lechatchila go ahead and be do mi'ilah? Now I will say, what does this mean? We know that if an animal is vested with sacrificial sanctity, you can't just redeem that animal for money. What normally has to happen, you have to allow the animal to graze. The animal develops a mum, which makes it invalid for the mizbeach, and then afterwards what? Then you could go ahead and redeem the animal. Here you're telling a person that they could proactively redeem an animal for money. It doesn't make sense. Ella hilchu bahen achar harov. But rather, again, what the Gemara says is lamaisa like this. The Gemara says that Lamaisa, we go after the rov, and what does the rov say? Im rov zecharim olos. If it's a male, the majority of males are olos. Im rov nekevos zivchei shlamim. If the majority of females, they're shlamim. So we'll say, look at the Tiklin Chadet, and he says, Im rov zecharim olos. V'achi perush demas Nisan. Im rov behemos shenimtzu zecharim kulan olos. Ve'im ruba nekevos av zechar. So we'll say, the Gemara says like this, that Lamaisa, we don't consider this active deconsecration of an animal. Why? Because at the end of the day, we don't really know the status of this animal. What we're trying to do is trying to hedge our bets. And we're just trying to say, in the event that it was a carbon, we're going to deal with its sanctity sufficiently. But because you don't really know what it is, the active deconsecration of an animal is not considered to be something that is wrong. So the Gemara says, but one second. So also the Gemara makes it sound that if it's a male, it's olos, and if it's a female, it's shlamim. Is that to say that a shlamim can't come from a male animal? It's not true. You can bring a male animal, a shlamim as well. So what do you do? Os ketzadu osa motzion lechulin v'chozer v'osa osan olos. So you want something very interesting. So what do? You go ahead and you deconsecrate the animals. And what does the Gemara say? And you go ahead and you bring them olos. And I will say, what does this mean? So take a look at the Karban Ha'eda once more. It begins on Amud Aleph. He says, Amanas Mishani Ketzur Osa Motzian Lechulin, Amanas Yachzru Lios Olos, Ve'ein Zechet, the Ha Al Kol Panam Akriva Gabi Mizbeach, Ve'yoser Nirali, the Av Zemin Akush After Rabbi Kasha Ketzur Osa, Ela Shemotzian Olos. So the Gemara essentially says Lamaisa like this. The Mishnah makes it sound like when you go ahead and you find this animal, that this animal is a carbon. The Gemara is saying we don't know what the animal is. All we have is a circumstantial reality that since the animal is in such close close proximity to Yerushalayim and it's just wandering around, chances are that it's a carbon. But because we don't know the absolute certainty that it's a carbon, therefore the easiest way for us to deal with this animal is to deconsecrate it onto money and to go ahead and use the money for sacrificial purposes. But how do I know what sacrificial purposes to use the animal for? To which the Gemara says, all we can go is after Rov. And Rov tells me that the Rov of male animals are olos, the Rov of female animals are shlomim, and that's what we're going to do. So the Gemara goes right to Amar Zira, Kamad da'at Amar Taman, Tinai Bezdinhu, Al Hamosoros, Sheyikruvu Olos. Kain at mar uf hacha Tinai Bezdinhu, Allah Ovdos, Allah or Allah Avudos, Shikruvu. So we'll say the Gemara says, Rabbi Zira gives a simpler idea. He says, listen, well, so we were speaking very, very extensively about this concept of Tanai Bezdin. So Tanai Bezdin means what? That Chazal legislated in certain circumstances how to deal with certain items. So, for example, Chazal said that if you have leftover half shekels, so what do you do with that? We go ahead and we use that to purchase olos. But why? Because that's what Chazal legislated. That's how Chazal set this system. So Chazal also legislated that if you have lost sacrificial items, that what do you do? If they're males, you go ahead and you give it as olos. And if you're females, you give them as shlam. So also what the Gemara is saying is, don't ask the question of how you can actively deconsecrate an animal, because that question is not shaykh here. Because here, only thing that's operating is what? Is the fact that Chazal made a Tanai. And the Tanai is, Chazal told you, this is how you resolve this particular circumstance. So the Gemara goes right to Amr Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yaakov ben Acha in Ein Zemezid. And again, in Torah, also to understand, when a person deconsecrates this animal, when do we get very nervous? If you actively, intentionally deconsecrate an animal. If I go ahead and I designate this little young goat, I don't want to say kid, this little young goat as a carbon, and then I say, you know what? No, I don't want to bring that goat, and I deconsecrate. I take the sanctity of the animal and put it back onto the money. That's what Chazal said. That's really not a good thing to do. I just want to point out, if you did it, it works. It works, but we don't want you doing that. That's called me'ilah. It's not real me'ilah. But what it means is you're taking liberties with consecrated property, which you can't do. That's not applicable over here. Why is it not applicable over here? Because here Chazal are telling you this is a different kind of case, and Chazal are telling you, I'm telling you how to go ahead. Chazal are telling us how to deal with this case. How do you deal with the case of the lost animal? Chazal want you to deconsecrate the animal onto money, keep the animal for yourself, and offer up the money depending on the gender of the animal. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yasa, while I was still in Bavel, Shamis called Rabbi Yehuda, Sha'al Shmuel. I heard Rabbi Yehuda ask the following question of Shmuel. Hifrish shiklo mace. Now, both say if a person separated out his half shekel and then he died before he got a chance to contribute it. So both say we've had this case already a number of times. Amrle, so what do you do with it? And he responded, Yiplu linidava. It goes into the Nadava. And I also remember, what does Nadava mean? Nadava is Ketz HaMizbeach, which is the dessert for the Mizbeach, which means what? It goes into the additional carbon fund. Umosar Asiris Ha'efa Shalo. And what happens if the Kohen Gadol has additional monies from his Asiris Ha'efa, his mincha offering? What happens, let's say the Kohen Gadol, remember the Asiris Ha'efa, I want to point out, comes from the Kohen Gadol's own personal funds. So let's say now the Kohen Gadol went ahead and was setting aside money for his Asiris Ha'efa, and he has leftover Asiris Ha'efa monies. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yolichim Yamamelech. You throw it into the Dead Sea, which is another way of saying what? You can't redistribute those funds. They can't be used for anything else. You can't go and allocate them for another carbon, because once they were set aside for Asiris Ha'efa, that's it. You're done. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yiplu l'nedava. Rabbi says no, they can be used ultimately for nedava, which means for olos. Asiris ha'efa shel kohen gadol. So now the Gemara records an interesting machlokes about the asiris ha'efa. Now remember, the asiris ha'efa is the mincha offering of the kohen gadol that he brings every day. Here's what everybody agrees with: it's a carbon that is split into two parts. One part is offered in the morning, and one part is offered in the afternoon. We're going to see a fundamental machlokes as to how it was created. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, chutza osa v'achar kach mekadsha. Rabbi Yochanan says you split it into two parts, and then only afterwards do you sanctify it. So also again, remember, how do you sanctify a carbon mincha? By putting it into a kli sharis, by putting it into one of the service utensils. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, you make it outside of the kli sharis, you split it into two parts, and you only sanctify it when it's actually going to be used. Okay. Rabbi Shlokish says no. So Rabbi Shlokish says no. What do? You make the whole thing in a kli sharis, And therefore, it all becomes kodesh from the beginning. And then what? And then after it's kodesh, then you divide it up. So we'll say fundamental machlokes is, do you consecrate it at the beginning, or do you consecrate it as it's being used? So you'll say to yourself, who cares? Here's an afkamina. So the Gemara says, Masnisa pligi al Rabbi Yochanan. We have a Mishnah that argues on Rabbi Yochanan. What's the case? Makriv mechza umechza. So, right, so what happens? We go ahead and we offer up the minchas, the Kohen Gadol offers up his asira sa'ifa piece by piece. Avad pasrala shekein afilu maos yelchu liamamelach. So we'll say, listen to this. So let's say I have the following case, and take a look for a moment at the Karban Ha'eda. So the Karban Ha'eda writes the following. He says, makriv mechza umechza avad. He says, it says, he quotes over here in Menachos, Perek Atcheles, Va'ayri kigon shenitma mechza bein ha'arvayim, shemevia isaron shalem v'chotzeu. So we'll say, listen to this. Let's say part of the Kohen Gadol's asira sa'ifa becomes tameh. So what happens, Rabbi Silber? So Lamaisa, what do we do in that circumstance? We go ahead and we bring a new asira sa'ifa, and look at the Karban Ha'eda. He says, "V'chotzeu umakriva mechza umechza avad shaminan deinhu kidusha lechatzoin elakula bebas achos v'kivan delo tzarich lemechza sheni shekvarnis kadesh haru office." Well, since this case, so let's say Kohen Gadol offers up his first half of the asira sa'ifa in the morning, and then what happens? The second half becomes tameh. So what do? The Mishnah says we bring a whole new asira sa'ifa and we offer half of it, and half of it gets thrown out. Now, what does that show? That shows that lamaisa, the entire asira sa'ifa is sanctified at once. Because if it wasn't all sanctified at once, all you need to do is sanctify one portion, and you don't have to throw out the second portion. The fact that you throw out the second portion indicates that it's all sanctified at once, which is a contradiction to Rabbi Yochanan. Masnisa plega Arab Shem and Lakish. There's the Mishnah that contradicts Rish Lakish. What does Rish Lakish say? Nimtzu shnei chatzo in kravin ushnei chatzo in avudin. Rish Lakish says that this was. If you take a look again at the Karban Ha'eda, Nimtzu beis chatzoin koin a koin gadol shekrivu mechza shachris umino achar tachtov maybe isaron shalim v'chotzeu umakriv mechza. So we'll say, listen to this. So the Gemara says, there, Rish Lakish says, if let's say, we'll say the Kohen Gadol died middle of the day, and they appoint another Kohen Gadol. So now the Kohen Gadol comes along and he offers up. So let's say Kohen Gadol number 1 offered up his half in the morning. Kohen Gadol number 2 offers up his half in the afternoon. And what do we say? V'tani Allah mechza rishon umechza sheni to ubar tzurasan v'yetzu lebeis hasreifa. And what do we say? That lamaisa again, the half of the Kohen Gadol's I should say the second half of the Kohen Gadol's, the second half of the first Kohen Gadol's mincha, and the second half of the second Kohen Gadol's mincha have to be left overnight and ultimately are taken out to the Beis HaSreifa. Passer law, Rabbi Shmuel da Amar Isaron Mekadesh. So Rabbi Lakish will interpret that case to mean like Rabbi Shmuel, who holds that what Rabbi say, that in fact it is all sanctified in a klisharis. Therefore, the entire thing is really sanctified from the beginning, and therefore lemaisa, that's why you have to throw out the remaining amount. Rabbi say, the whole yisod is: do you sanctify the fundamental machlokes is? Do you sanctify the entire asira sa'ifa at once, or do you sanctify it as needed? What's the nafkamina? The practical difference will be in this case where the Kohen Gadol dies midday. So what do you do then with the remaining part of his mincha? Can you just set it aside? Because essentially it's not consecrated, and therefore you could use it for something else. Or do we say, no, it's been consecrated, but it can't be offered because it was consecrated for Kohen Gadol A, and Kohen Gadol A is now dead. Kisha Kohen miskarev tchila lavo, the maybe asir se'ifa shalarbosai. Again, when a Kohen, I should say it's actually when any Kohen, when a Kohen is inaugurated for the first time for his service, he brings an asira sa'ifa of his own money, va'ovda biyado, and he offers it himself. Echad Kohen Gadol ve'echad Kohen Hedyot she'avdu ad shelo heviu asira sa'ifa shalaim avodas kshus. So this is very interesting. So a Kohen Gadol on his first day on the job, and a Kohen Hedyot, a regular Kohen on his first day on the job, each of them have to bring an asira sa'ifa of their own money, and they offer it themselves. But if they began to do their avoda and they did not bring the asira sa'ifa, their avoda is still kosher. Rabbi Mana boi meimar bo bayom sheniskariv tchila la'avoda bo bayom nismana lekohen gadol. Rabbi Mana wanted to say the following: on the day when a regular kohen first begins his service as a kohen, or on the day where a kohen gadol first begins his service as kohen gadol, maybe shtaim, he actually brings two asir seifas, two mincha offerings. Why? Achas lechinucho, one in honor of his inauguration, va'achas lechovas hayom, and one as obligatory for the day. So the Gemara says, Tofini. The Gemara over here quotes the pasuk by the karban mincha. The Torah says tufine. Now tufine Rabosa means baked items plural. So the Gemara says, why does it call the karban mincha baked plural? B'shas hava tofini ve'in b'shachris tofini. It teaches me that when does the mincha have to be baked? When do the loaves have to be baked? They only have to be baked at the time when the karban is offered, i.e. by daybreak, and not earlier. Shachris over here means by dawn, not early. So they have to be baked already when it's daytime, and not earlier than daytime. But we learned that one of the things that they used to do in the Beis Midrash is they would wake the chavitin bakers. Time to make the chavitin, right? They had to go ahead and wake the chavitin bakers early in the morning. So that seems to indicate what Rabbi say, that the chavitim are these loaves of mincha, or wafers of mincha, really loaves that they would go ahead and bake them early in the morning. No. What that means is they would wake them early to go ahead and heat the water for the scalded loaf. We will see Rabbi said that certain menachos were first boiled in water and then baked afterwards. So they would get them up early in the morning to get the fire going to boil the water, but they would not actually bake until daybreak. Tofine, Rabbi Yassi b'shem Rabbi Chanina, mitagna va'achar kach ofa osa. So we'll say Rabbi Yassi and Rabbi Chanina said the way they would make these loaves for the mincha is they would first literally mitagna, fry them, and then afterwards they would bake them. Rabbi Acha b'shem Rabbi Chanina, ofa osa va'achach mitagna. No, they would first bake it and then they would fry it. Tofine, again I will say tofine, what they're picking up on is the fact that it says baked plural. The fact that it's baked plural is that in the preparation of these items there are multiple cooking processes applied. So did you bake it first or did you and fry it after? Did you fry it first and then bake it? That's a machlokes. Te'afena, what does it mean te'afena? No. Tofine, te'afena, no. Literally means you should bake it raw. What that means, Rabbi say, is that before you cook it, before you finally bake it, you should bring it to some level of partial cookedness and then bake off the rest. Rebbe says, te'afena no'eh, bake it nicely. Now I'll say, what does it mean, bake it nicely? Bake it nicely means ultimately make sure that it's prepared in a nice fashion. Rabbi Dosa Omer, te'afena riba asyon. Te'afena riba asyon alin. Let's take a look at Tiklin Charatin. Asyon ilin plugta. Kilomar plugta damaroi asyon plugta dahanach tanoi kidemask kamon. Man damer te'afena na. Kiman damer ofe v'achach matagna. Uman damer te'afena na. Kiman damer matagna v'achach ofe. So what is the Gemara saying? Fundamental machlokes as to how to prepare the loaves for the menachos. But essentially everybody's getting it from the same thing, which is tofena, or I should say not tofena, tufine. That tufine means baked plural, which indicates, that's what Rabbi say, that in the preparation of these loaves, there are multiple cooking processes that occurs. There's baking, there's frying, there's partial baking. A little bit more, just quickly. Lo sof davar shemes. Actually, we'll say, we'll have to stop over here. All right, we'll pick up over here. I apologize for going fast towards the end. I took my time too much on with Aleph. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up right over here tomorrow.